When I saw my husband holding that small folded note, my stomach dropped, but not from the fear of him yelling, not from panic about what would happen next. It was because of the handwriting on that paper, so unmistakably not his, so undeniably fresh in my mind. The note I thought I had thrown away days ago. The note that was never meant for him. He turned it over in his fingers, brow furrowing, as though he couldn't quite connect the dots yet, as though he thought it was nothing more than a reminder. But I saw the moment his expression shifted, the flicker of confusion replaced by a sharper, darker light. I reached out, my hand shaking, trying to snatch it back before his eyes traced those few simple words I had foolishly written. He held it just out of reach, reading. His jaw tightened. I could feel my own breath catch in my throat as I watched him decipher every curve of the ink, each letter like a nail being driven into the coffin of our life together. I felt the walls of the kitchen closing in around me, like the whole house could hear the thundering of my heart. That folded note had been innocent enough when I wrote it, at least that's what I had told myself then, a silly, dangerous impulse that shouldn't have meant anything. But now, in his hands, it was damning. His fingers trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but I saw it. He turned to me, his mouth opening, then closing again. He didn't need to say a word. I already knew he would ask who it was for, why it was written. And more than that, I knew he'd see the truth in my face before I even spoke. 3 months ago, something happened. Something that started small, so small I could almost pretend it wasn't real. But it grew. It grew until it became the one thing I couldn't ignore. The one thing that led to this moment, standing in my kitchen with my husband holding my secret in his hand. Before I tell you what was on that note, before I explain why I wrote it at all, let me start at the very beginning, because only by going back will you understand how my entire life unraveled. The washing machine had been humming for almost an hour that morning, the same steady sound it made every other Tuesday when I went through the motions of laundry day. I stood there, watching the white shirts swirl in the soapy water, and felt that familiar emptiness tugging at me again. It wasn't that my marriage was bad. It wasn't broken, it wasn't loveless. But it was, still. Like a pond that hasn't been stirred for too long. My husband had left early, as always. A quick kiss on the cheek, a mumbled "I'll be late," and the slam of the front door. He never meant to be cold, that's just how he was. Reliable. Predictable. Safe. And safe had slowly become suffocating. I was rinsing out the sink when I heard a car pull into the driveway. At first I thought it was a delivery, maybe a neighbor. But then the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there he stood, my husband's nephew. He was carrying a small bag over his shoulder, the kind you pack for a weekend, not for moving in. He smiled, a little unsure of himself, and explained he'd be staying for a while. "Just a few days," he said. "Uncle said it was fine." I nodded, welcoming him in, though my mind stumbled over the suddenness of it all. The house felt different the moment he stepped inside, like a window had been cracked open and a breeze had slipped through. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten thousands of quiet dinners with my husband. The nephew talked easily, about school, about plans, about nothing and everything, and I found myself listening in a way I hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. There was something refreshing about the way he spoke, unfiltered and light, like he didn't know how to weigh every word down with tired familiarity. My husband called around noon. "I'll be away for a couple of nights," he said, his voice brisk, already thinking about work. "Don't wait up." He didn't even ask if it was all right for his nephew to stay longer, he simply assumed it would be. And of course it was. What reason could I possibly give to say no? After the call, the house grew quieter, though not in the usual, heavy way it did when he left. This quiet felt charged, like static before a storm. I tried to keep busy. Laundry folded, counters wiped, floors swept, all the tiny tasks that had once felt like my shield against boredom. But I kept catching glimpses of the guest in my home. Passing by the living room and seeing him flipping through a book, or stepping outside and hearing him humming faintly while he checked the garden. That evening, we ended up in the kitchen again. I don't even remember how the conversation started, but I do remember the way I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that crept up unexpectedly and stayed in your chest long after. I couldn't recall the last time I'd laughed like that with my husband. As I washed the last plate of the evening, I glanced at him. There was nothing unusual about the way he stood there, talking about some half-forgotten memory. But something shifted in me. I couldn't name it then. When I finally went to bed that night, the house was still. I lay there next to the empty space my husband had left behind, listening to the faint sound of the wind outside, and felt my thoughts circling back to the guest sleeping just one room away. I told myself it was nothing. That it would stay nothing. But even then, even on that first day, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years, the sense that my life, steady and safe and sealed shut, might have just been cracked open. The next morning started differently. There was an unspoken awareness hanging in the air, like the room had changed shape overnight even though nothing had moved. I woke earlier than usual, as if my own mind had decided I needed to brace myself for the day before it unfolded. The kitchen felt cooler, quieter, and when I stepped inside, I saw him there already, pouring coffee into a chipped mug like he'd been doing it for years. He greeted me casually, just a small morning, but there was something about the way he looked up, a flicker of hesitation, as if he wondered if he should even be there. I noticed that hesitation, and for some reason, it unsettled me. I busied myself with breakfast, moving around the counters with unnecessary precision. Every sound, the clink of a spoon, the drip of the faucet, felt louder than usual. He sat at the table, elbows resting on the wood, fingers wrapped around the mug, and I caught him watching me more than once. It wasn't invasive, it was curious, almost like he was trying to understand who I was when the house was just this quiet. We started talking about nothing in particular, weather, errands, the new store that had opened down the road. There was an ease in his voice, but underneath it, I could sense an unspoken question in every word. I wondered if he noticed that my husband rarely filled the space with words anymore, that conversations at this table had become brief, practical exchanges. I dropped a spoon, and it hit the floor with an absurdly loud clang. I bent to pick it up, and when I straightened, he was already standing, holding out a napkin. Our hands touched, just for a second, but it was enough to send a strange jolt through me, one I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural reaction of two people in close proximity. But as I wiped the spoon and placed it on the counter, my own pulse betrayed me. Later that morning, he helped me carry a basket of laundry to the living room. It wasn't heavy, but he offered anyway, saying something about how it looked like too much for one person. I almost protested, but instead, I let him take it. He walked ahead of me, and I found myself noticing small things, the way he moved, the easy way he filled the space, how unguarded he seemed. We folded clothes together. He asked questions about the neighborhood, about the old house, about my routines. Simple things. But they didn't feel simple. Every question seemed to peel back a layer I hadn't shown in years, and I wasn't sure if that made me uneasy or relieved. When my husband called that afternoon, his voice was distant, brisk. "I'll be staying longer," he said, as if it were nothing. "You'll manage?" Of course I would manage. I always managed. But when I hung up, I realized how quickly I had accepted that answer, how little emotion it stirred in me anymore. I found him later in the kitchen again. He was leaning against the counter, eating an apple, a small, almost careless smile on his face when he saw me. There was a lightness in the air that didn't belong to me, but it seeped in anyway, uninvited. We ended up standing too close as we cleaned up after dinner. I reached for a plate, he reached for the same plate, and suddenly his hand was covering mine. It should have been awkward, but neither of us moved right away. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was heavy, like the pause before a storm breaks. He laughed softly, saying, "I should let you handle this," but he didn't step back immediately. His laughter wasn't mocking, it was nervous, uncertain. As I turned, he was there, closer than I expected. I could hear the sound of his breath, and my own felt uneven in my chest. There was a beat, one moment suspended in the air like it might last forever, and then it didn't. We kissed. There was no preparation, no warning, just that undeniable moment where the world narrowed down to a single point. It wasn't long, it wasn't planned, but it was enough. Enough to tip something inside me from balance into chaos. When we stepped back, the room looked the same, but nothing felt the same. He didn't speak, and I couldn't bring myself to. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. I remember the way the light faded through the windows, the way the shadows stretched across the walls. I remember sitting on the couch, folding and refolding the same blanket just to keep my hands busy. I told myself a dozen things in the silence. That it didn't mean anything. That it wouldn't happen again. That it was just an impulsive mistake. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't escape the weight of it. Not guilt exactly, not yet. Something sharper, more complicated. Something that whispered in the dark that nothing in my life was going to stay untouched now. The day after that kiss began in a strange kind of quiet. Not the quiet of an empty house or a sleeping neighborhood, but the kind that hums underneath your skin, like something is waiting to be acknowledged. I woke up feeling oddly aware of every sound, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the wind brushing against the window. It felt like the walls of the house had learned my secret before I had even decided what to call it. I tried to start my morning like any other. Coffee, dishes, laundry. But the rhythm was off. My hands didn't move with their usual efficiency. I dropped a towel, spilled a little sugar on the counter, found myself standing still in the middle of the kitchen without knowing what I had gone in there for. He came downstairs later than usual, hair still damp from the shower, his voice soft when he said, "Morning." It was almost ordinary. Almost. But there was something in his tone, not hesitation, not boldness either, but something in between, like he was testing how the day would respond. I managed a small nod, the kind that might have meant anything. And then there was that moment, fleeting and fragile, when we locked eyes for just a little too long. Neither of us said anything about what had happened the night before. Neither of us even hinted at it. But the silence between us felt crowded, like an uninvited guest that had decided to stay. He poured himself coffee, and I realized my heart was racing at the sight of something so mundane. I didn't want to notice, but I did, how close his hand was to mine when he set the mug on the table, how his sleeve brushed against my arm when he reached for the sugar. I told myself it was just awkwardness, that of course things would feel strange after a moment like that. But deep down, I knew awkwardness wasn't the whole story. The phone rang in the late morning. My husband's voice came through, steady, efficient. He said he would be away a little longer, that there were things to wrap up. I told him it was fine, that we were fine. I said the words like I'd said them 100 times before, but as I hung up, I felt the weight of them sink into me. After the call, the house felt heavier somehow. I couldn't decide if it was guilt or relief pressing down on me, or both. I found him sitting on the porch a little later, scrolling on his phone absent-mindedly, his leg bouncing with some restless energy. He looked up when I stepped outside, and for a second it felt like we might actually talk about it. But we didn't. Instead, we talked about safe things. The weather. The neighbor's overgrown hedge. A story about how the old fence down the road had been knocked over by a storm. But even those words felt like they were balancing on a tightrope, careful not to lean too far in either direction. I made lunch, and he offered to help. He stood close, too close for it to feel unintentional, and I could sense him hesitating sometimes, his hand pausing before taking the plate from me, his breath catching slightly before speaking. It was maddening how normal everything seemed and how different it felt. Every ordinary action had been turned into something sharp-edged. Later in the afternoon, we both ended up in the living room. I don't remember how it happened, only that he was sitting on the couch and I sat down at the other end, leaving space between us. Too much space to be casual, not enough to erase the memory of last night. We talked about movies. He pulled up an old one on the TV, something I hadn't seen in decades, and we sat there watching, making comments every now and then. But I wasn't really focused on the movie. I was focused on how close we felt, even sitting apart. On how every laugh felt heavier than it should. I noticed how he glanced at me sometimes, like he was about to say something and then thought better of it. At one point, our hands brushed when we both reached for the remote. I pulled back quickly, maybe too quickly. He gave a small, nervous smile, not embarrassed, not confident, just caught somewhere between. As the sun started to set, the light in the room changed, softening everything. I could see the dust floating in the air, slow and lazy, and for some reason it made the moment feel even more fragile. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. I caught myself staring at him more than once, only to look away just as fast, pretending to focus on my plate. By the time I went upstairs, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Lying in bed, I kept replaying the day in my head, every glance, every silence, every moment that could have meant nothing but didn't. I thought about the kiss again, and how we hadn't spoken about it. About how pretending it hadn't happened didn't erase the fact that it had. And somewhere between those thoughts, I realized that silence was its own choice. That by not saying anything, by not naming what had happened, we had allowed it to linger. To grow. I fell asleep knowing the air would be thicker tomorrow, knowing that every ordinary thing would only feel more complicated, and that ignoring it wouldn't make it disappear. The following day started with the same pale light bleeding through the curtains, but nothing felt like the day before. I lingered in bed longer than I should have, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the thoughts circling in my head. Every time I replayed that kiss, I felt an ache of confusion run through me. It wasn't guilt alone, and it wasn't desire alone, it was something in between, something I didn't even have words for. I moved through the morning slowly, hoping the slowness would smooth out the sharpness of what I was feeling. I made coffee, wiped down counters that didn't need it, refolded dish towels I had folded the night before. He hadn't come downstairs yet, and that was almost a relief. Almost. Because the longer I waited for him to appear, the more I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me. When he finally did come down, it was in that casual, quiet way that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. He said morning again, like he had the day before, but there was the smallest pause before the word, and I caught it. I noticed the pause, the slight way his eyes searched mine for something. Maybe the same thing I was searching for. We didn't mention the kiss. Of course we didn't. Instead, we talked about groceries. He offered to go with me when I said I needed to make a trip into town, and I didn't say no. The drive was ordinary, the hum of the road, the faint rattle in the car that had been there for years. But the silence between us wasn't ordinary. It wasn't uncomfortable either. It was taut, like a wire strung too tight, humming with something that neither of us dared to name. He fiddled with the radio, settled on a station that played songs too soft to really hear. I watched the scenery blur past, familiar streets that looked strangely different simply because he was there in the passenger seat. At the store, we moved through the aisles side by side. He picked things off shelves without asking, dropped them in the basket with an ease that made it feel like he belonged there. It was unsettling how normal it all felt, how natural it seemed to have him reach for a jar on the top shelf when I couldn't, or to carry the heavier bags without me needing to say a word. At the register, his hand brushed mine as he passed me the receipt. Just a brush, nothing more, but the same jolt ran through me like it had before. The ride home felt shorter, though maybe it was because I couldn't stop thinking about how strange the day had already become. When we carried the bags into the house, we laughed over a dropped carton of eggs, his quick reflexes catching it before it hit the floor. The laugh wasn't just about the eggs. It was too warm, too unguarded. Back in the kitchen, we unpacked groceries together. I reached for a jar at the same time he did, and again our hands met. This time, neither of us pulled back immediately. There was a hesitation in that pause, a space that felt louder than words. The afternoon blurred into a string of moments that felt small but weren't. He stood close while I chopped vegetables, and I could feel his presence like a pulse. He asked me about my husband's work, about how long he'd be gone. The question was casual, but I heard the undercurrent in it. By evening, the light had shifted, that golden, sinking kind of light that makes the house feel softer, almost fragile. We ended up on the back porch after dinner. The sky was streaked with fading colors, and we sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't empty. He said something about how quiet the neighborhood was. I said something about how it had always been this way. Our words were light, but the pauses between them were heavy. I realized then how much I had started noticing every detail about him, the way he leaned against the railing, the way his hand curled loosely around a glass of water, the way he tilted his head when he listened. And I realized something else too. I was beginning to search for those details. Noticing wasn't an accident anymore. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the lights in the kitchen were dimmed, I walked past the living room and saw him there, sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, met my eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to still. I kept walking, but my steps felt heavier than they should have. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how close we'd been all day, in the car, in the store, in the kitchen. How every shared glance, every too long pause, every laugh had stacked on top of each other, building something I couldn't take apart anymore. I told myself we hadn't crossed another line that day. That we'd kept it safe. But I also knew that lines weren't always crossed with grand gestures. Sometimes they were crossed in a grocery aisle, with a laugh over a carton of eggs, with a hand that lingers on yours just a second too long. And once you cross one, you start to wonder how many more there are, and how many more you're willing to step over without even realizing it. The morning light came in thin and pale, touching the edges of the furniture in a way that made everything in the room look slightly unreal, like a painting I could step into but not fully belong to. I moved through the kitchen quietly, the air heavy with the things I wasn't saying, with the things I didn't dare name. The house felt fuller now, and not because of noise, it was because of him. The awareness of him seemed to seep into every corner, as though even the walls understood something had shifted. I set out breakfast like I always did, but my movements were slower, careful, like each plate and cup might betray what I was feeling. He came into the room just as I was reaching for the coffee pot. He said good morning in the same easy way, but the space between us carried a tension that neither of us could quite disguise. I tried to focus on mundane things. Toast. Sugar. The way the spoon clinked against the side of the cup. But it was impossible to stop noticing him, the way his sleeve brushed against my arm when he reached for a napkin, the way his fingers lingered a second longer than needed when he handed me the butter. After breakfast, we both found ourselves outside, drawn to the quiet of the garden. The morning air had a coolness to it, the kind that wakes you up even if you're still half asleep inside. I started pulling weeds near the flower bed, and he joined me without being asked. His presence felt natural, like it belonged there, but at the same time it made my heart beat just a little faster. We worked side by side. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my back and, more acutely, the warmth of him nearby. He reached for the watering can, and our hands collided, not just brushed, but collided. Neither of us pulled away immediately. I straightened up, brushing the dirt from my hands, and for a second our eyes met. There was nothing said. There didn't need to be. The day stretched ahead, quiet but charged. We went inside, and he helped me in the kitchen again, passing me things, standing close enough that the air between us felt different. The silence wasn't empty. It had weight. Every shared glance, every pause felt like it added to something neither of us had the courage to name. By the time the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, we were both restless in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. We ended up in the living room, both pretending to read me with a magazine, him scrolling on his phone. Neither of us turned the page or looked at the screen for long. Our attention kept slipping sideways, to each other. At one point, I put down the magazine and stood to adjust the curtains. When I turned, he was standing too, as though he had been waiting for that movement. There was no plan, no pause for thought. There was only the space closing between us. We kissed. It was not like the first one. That had been a slip, a moment that felt like it might have been erased if either of us had chosen to step back quickly enough. But this kiss carried the weight of choice. It was slower, more deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't an accident anymore. When we stepped apart, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The room felt different now, the air heavier, like something irreversible had just taken root. The rest of the day passed in fragments. The sounds of the house, doors creaking, the distant hum of the fridge, the clock ticking, all felt sharper, louder, like they were marking every second of what had changed. I moved through the motions of dinner, setting the table, stirring the pot, but my thoughts were a blur. He moved around the kitchen too, his presence now both comforting and unbearably intense. When we sat down to eat, the conversation was lighter than I expected. Almost too light, as though we both knew we couldn't press too hard on what had just happened without breaking something fragile. That night, after everything was cleaned up and the house settled into its evening stillness, I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the kiss again, about how deliberate it had been, about how I hadn't wanted to pull away. I thought about what it meant, about what it might mean tomorrow, or the day after that. And I realized something that made my breath catch. I wasn't wondering if there would be another line crossed. I was wondering when. The next morning arrived with the same sunlight creeping through the curtains, but I woke up with the distinct heaviness of what we had done the day before. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss, not this time. It was the quiet certainty that something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't undo, no matter how much I might try. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar outlines of my life pressing against me. My husband's side of the bed still held the faint scent of his cologne, a reminder that this house was ours, that this marriage still existed, even if it had grown thin and tired. I thought about the man I had promised my life to, how our days had grown predictable, how we rarely surprised each other anymore. There was no real anger in those thoughts, no blame. Just a dull ache, the kind that comes when you realize something important has been missing for so long that you almost forgot it used to be there. When I finally rose, I moved quietly down the stairs, hoping for a few moments to gather myself before he appeared. But he was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as I entered, and there it was again, that pause, that searching look in his eyes. It felt like a question neither of us dared to ask out loud. Breakfast was a blur of small, meaningless actions, plates stacked, toast buttered, cups refilled. He asked if I'd slept well, and I said yes. I asked if he needed anything from town, and he said no. On the surface, it was as ordinary as any other morning, but every word seemed to land heavier than it should, like we were speaking through a fog. Later, I found myself in the living room, sorting through a basket of folded laundry I'd left there the night before. He came in and sat on the edge of the couch, not saying much, just watching as I moved shirts into neat piles. The silence was strange, not uncomfortable, but weighted. I could feel his presence like a pulse in the room. The phone rang mid-morning. My husband's voice filled the line, brisk and efficient, the same voice I'd grown used to over the years. "Another couple of days," he said, almost like an afterthought. "Don't wait up." I murmured that it was fine, that we'd be fine. When I hung up, I stared at the receiver for longer than I needed to, the reality of his absence suddenly feeling sharper, almost deliberate. After lunch, the day dragged. I tried to busy myself, tidying shelves, wiping counters, refolding towels, but none of it quieted my thoughts. He moved around the house too, a steady presence, close enough to feel but not so close that it felt invasive. In the afternoon, he stepped into the room with a hesitant suggestion, a walk. "It's clear out," he said, his voice easy, as if he were offering nothing more than a way to pass the time. I said yes before I could think of a reason to say no. We left the house and wandered down the road, the air cool but not biting, the sky an endless stretch of pale blue. The walk should have been simple, but every step felt like it was carrying something unspoken. We talked as we walked, about the quiet street, about the neighbor's dog barking behind a fence, about nothing that mattered. But beneath the words was something else, an awareness that neither of us could quite mask. When we turned back toward the house, I caught myself noticing how close he walked beside me, how his shoulder nearly brushed mine, how neither of us stepped aside to make more space. Back home, the evening settled in slow and heavy. I cooked dinner, the sounds of chopping and simmering filling the kitchen, while he set the table without being asked. We moved around each other easily, almost too easily, like we'd done it 100 times before. The conversation over dinner was light, almost careful. We stayed in safe territory, favorite foods, small stories, even a joke or two. But under every word, there was something more, an unspoken truth that seemed to hum between us. When the dishes were done, the house grew quiet again. He sat on the couch, and I sat in the armchair, both pretending to watch the muted TV. I couldn't focus on the screen. My thoughts kept circling back to the kiss, to yesterday, to how far we'd already gone, and to the uneasy truth that I didn't know how to stop the momentum now. Later, when I finally went upstairs, the stillness of the house felt heavier than ever. I stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the darkened street, wondering how many more steps we'd take, and how many of them would be ones we couldn't come back from. Lying in bed, I felt the ache of it all, the pull of what had already happened, the guilt, the strange thrill, the quiet fear. I closed my eyes and told myself to sleep, but the truth wouldn't leave me alone, the truth that something had started, and even in my deepest denial, I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The morning broke with a sky that seemed to hold its breath, gray clouds rolling lazily over the horizon. I stood by the window for longer than I should have, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The night before hadn't left me, it clung to me like a second skin, and the memory of every choice I'd made in the past days pressed heavier than ever. I could feel the unease building, but it wasn't only unease. There was something else, an almost reckless awareness that every step we took from here would push us further down a path that neither of us had planned, and maybe neither of us could stop. Breakfast passed quietly, as if we were both unwilling to disturb the fragile balance that had formed between us. We moved around the kitchen like we were reading from the same script, each gesture mirroring the other, each word measured. Afterwards, he suggested a drive. "Just a simple drive," he said. "It might be good to get out of the house for a while." The suggestion felt harmless, but deep inside I knew it wasn't. I agreed anyway. The air outside was cooler than I expected, carrying that faint smell of rain that lingers before a storm. We got into the car, and as the engine started, a strange quiet settled over me. The road stretched out ahead, narrow and winding, leading us away from the town, away from anything familiar. The first few miles were uneventful. We spoke about the scenery, the trees, the way the sky seemed close enough to touch. But the conversation didn't fill the space between us. It only highlighted it, that invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing minute. After a while, the houses grew sparse, replaced by fields and long stretches of empty road. The silence deepened. I could hear the hum of the tires against the asphalt, the faint rattle in the glove compartment, even the sound of his breathing. At some point, I realized I'd stopped thinking about the destination. The drive itself had become the destination. We pulled off the road near a small clearing, an unremarkable spot, but quiet. Too quiet. We stepped out of the car, the sound of gravel crunching under our shoes. The air smelled of earth and leaves, and I felt the weight of everything pressing down harder now that we weren't moving. We walked a little, saying almost nothing. Every step felt deliberate, like the ground beneath us might give way if we weren't careful. At some point, we stopped. There was no grand reason, no obvious cue, we just stopped, standing there with only the soft wind and our own breath between us. The words wouldn't come. Maybe they weren't meant to. Instead, there was only the moment and the inevitability of it. We spent the night together. When morning came, the world felt different. The drive back was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, full of the weight of what had happened, of what couldn't be taken back. The house looked the same when we returned, the same walls, the same familiar corners, but I didn't feel the same walking through the door. I moved through the rooms with my hands trembling slightly, every detail sharper than before, the smell of the dish soap, the sound of the refrigerator motor, the creak in the hallway floorboard. He carried himself carefully too, quieter than usual, as if he didn't want to disturb the fragile balance we'd brought back with us. The day felt long, endless almost, though we barely spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and neither of us knew where to begin. That night, lying in my own bed, the truth settled over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Nothing could ever go back to how it was before. And I wasn't sure if I wanted it to. The morning after we came back felt like waking up inside a different version of my own life. The house was the same photos on the walls, the same half-used jar of jam in the fridge, the same faint creak on the top stair, but nothing about it felt familiar anymore. Every corner seemed to echo louder, every glance felt heavier. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee machine as if it might somehow distract me, but my hands shook slightly when I reached for the mug. The coffee tasted bitter, though I'd added the same amount of sugar I always did. It wasn't the coffee that had changed. It was me. He came downstairs later, slower than usual. He didn't look at me right away. His footsteps on the stairs seemed too loud, like the sound itself was saying something neither of us wanted to hear. When he finally did look up, our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like standing on thin ice. One wrong step, one wrong word, and it would all crack beneath us. Breakfast was quiet. I buttered toast I didn't want to eat, poured juice I didn't drink. He sat across from me, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his glass, a restless habit that made my stomach knot. I thought about my husband then, how many mornings he'd sat in that exact same chair, how many breakfasts had passed in a haze of routine. I wondered if he would notice anything when he came home. Would he sense something in the air? Would he see it in my face, in the way I moved? After breakfast, I busied myself with chores that didn't need doing. I folded laundry that was already folded, wiped counters that were already clean, rearranged the pantry shelves just to give my hands something to do. He offered to help, his voice calm, but there was a carefulness in the way he moved, like he was afraid to break something invisible between us. The silence wasn't empty. It pressed down on us, filling the space between every word, every movement. Around midday, I found him in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up when I entered, but neither of us said anything at first. The phone rang. My husband's voice filled the room through the receiver, steady, predictable, almost distant. "I'll be home soon," he said. "Probably tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word hit me harder than I expected. Tomorrow meant everything we had done, everything that had been said and left unsaid, everything that had changed. It all had an end date now. The walls of the house seemed to tighten around me as I said, "Okay," into the phone, my voice steady, though I felt anything but. When I hung up, I caught his eyes. He'd heard. He didn't ask for details, but he didn't need to. The rest of the day felt like it was lived in fragments. I remember making lunch, my hands moving automatically while my thoughts spun in circles. I remember hearing him open and close the back door, stepping outside for a while, like the walls were pressing on him too. I remember standing at the window, watching him from a distance as he stood in the yard, staring at the sky. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, turning the house gold and soft, but the softness felt like a trick. He came back inside, quieter than before, his steps careful on the wooden floor. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence carried its own weight, its own language. Dinner was a strange, strained ritual. I cooked, he set the table, and every action felt rehearsed, like we were both trying to remember what normal looked like. After the plates were cleared, we sat in the living room again. The TV was on, low, a movie neither of us were really watching. The distance between us felt measured, deliberate, but our thoughts weren't as neatly contained. I could feel them, my own swirling, his unspoken but heavy, and it was too much. Later, upstairs, I lay awake in bed, listening to the faint creak of the house settling for the night. I thought about the word my husband had said, tomorrow. I thought about the hours left, about what would change when he walked through the door again. And I thought about the fact that no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, nothing about me would be the same when he did. The word tomorrow stayed with me through the night, like a whisper I couldn't silence. When I woke, it was still there, pressing against me in the dim light of early morning. Tomorrow wasn't an idea anymore, it had turned into today. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. My husband would be home in hours. The thought should have brought comfort, the kind of comfort I used to rely on. Instead, it felt like the air in the house had thinned, and every breath took more effort. Downstairs, the house looked ordinary enough, but nothing about it felt ordinary. The dishes from last night were still by the sink, the clock ticked in that steady way it always had. But every sound seemed sharper, louder, like the walls themselves were bracing for what was coming. He came down a little later, his steps quiet, almost too careful. He said morning, the word soft, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if it would land safely. I answered, but my voice didn't sound like my own, it was thinner, strained. Breakfast passed without much being said. I buttered toast, poured coffee, and tried to focus on the motions of my hands, anything to keep me from looking up too often. When I did, I found his eyes waiting, holding questions he didn't ask. The silence between us wasn't the same silence we'd shared before. It was heavier now, almost suffocating, filled with everything that couldn't be spoken. At some point, I realized I was avoiding mirrors. I didn't want to see my own reflection, didn't want to face what might show in my eyes. The phone rang just before noon. My husband's voice was clear, steady. "I'm leaving now. I'll be there this evening." I said, "Okay," and even that single word felt like it took effort. My throat was dry, my hand tight around the receiver. When I hung up, the room felt smaller. He had heard the call, of course he had. He didn't ask what my husband had said. He didn't have to. For the rest of the day, time slowed down. The hours felt long, each one stretching into the next. I cleaned without thinking, scrubbing counters that didn't need it, straightening books on the shelf, folding the same towels twice. He moved through the house too, quieter than ever, his steps almost soundless, his presence a reminder that none of this could be undone. By afternoon, the tension was unbearable. I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at nothing. The yard was still, the trees unmoving, but I felt like the ground under me was shifting. A draft of air made the note slip off the counter. Just a folded piece of paper I'd left there without thinking. I bent to pick it up, and my breath caught when I saw the writing on it, my own. Words I'd written days ago, maybe weeks, a careless moment turned into something dangerous. I didn't even hear him step into the room until he spoke softly. "What's that?" My hand tightened around the note. "Nothing," I said, too quickly. But it didn't matter. Because I knew what would happen next. The paper felt heavier than it should have, and my mind rushed through 1,000 thoughts, how to hide it, how to explain it, how to make it mean less than it did. And underneath all of that, the truth burned. I had written something I couldn't take back. I had written something that, if read by the wrong eyes, would unravel everything. As the hours closed in and the clock ticked closer to evening, I couldn't escape that thought. The note. The words. The way even the smallest things could become the sharpest knives when they were left lying in the open. By the time the sky outside started to turn, the walls of the house felt tighter, as if they were closing in. The day had been long, but I knew the longest hours were still to come. Evening fell in slow motion. The light slipped away from the windows, stretching the shadows long across the kitchen floor, turning the familiar into something uncertain. I heard my husband's car before I saw it, the slow crunch of tires on the gravel in the driveway, the muted hum of the engine cutting through the stillness. Every sound in the house felt magnified, every breath, every heartbeat echoing in my chest. I stood at the kitchen sink, hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles ached. I heard the front door open, the old hinges protesting, and his footsteps, steady, unmistakable, crossing the threshold. For a moment, I felt like I was suspended outside my own life, watching everything from a distance, waiting for something inevitable to break. He walked into the kitchen, setting his bag down by the table. He looked tired, his face drawn from the long drive, but his eyes searched my face, as if he was looking for something he couldn't quite name. I managed a smile, the kind you give when you're trying to remember how it feels to be normal. He stepped forward and wrapped me in a brief hug, the kind of greeting that once would have been enough. "It's good to be home," he said, his voice soft but carrying more meaning than usual. I nodded, but my throat was too tight to trust words. Dinner was quiet. The three of us sat at the table, passing dishes back and forth, filling the air with small talk that felt painfully rehearsed. I noticed how my husband watched me, sometimes too closely, sometimes not at all. I noticed how my own hands shook when I reached for the water pitcher. I noticed how he, across the table, kept his gaze fixed on his plate, eating in careful, measured bites. After the meal, my husband excused himself to the living room to rest. I started to clear the table, stacking plates, scraping leftovers into the bin. He helped without being asked, our hands moving in silent coordination. There was a brief moment, just us in the kitchen, where our eyes met. The unspoken things between us crowded the small space, but we didn't say a word. We didn't need to. Everything that mattered was there in the way we moved, in the things we didn't say. As I finished washing the last dish, I heard the sound, the quiet, papery flutter of a note slipping to the floor. I turned to see my husband standing at the end of the counter, the folded paper in his hand. My heart stopped. I watched as he turned it over, reading the words in my handwriting. The seconds stretched impossibly long. He looked up at me, his face changing, confusion at first, then hurt, then something harder, more final. I tried to step forward, tried to find words that might soften what he'd just read, but nothing came. The silence was absolute. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just stood there, the note shaking in his hand, and in his eyes I saw the realization dawn, a slow, quiet breaking that felt more painful than anything loud could have been. He left the room without a word. I heard him gather his things, heard the creak of the front door opening again. The bag hit the floor by the threshold. The footsteps, first heavy, then lighter, moved away from me, away from the life we'd built together. The door closed with a finality that made the walls themselves seem to flinch. The house was suddenly silent. Utterly, entirely silent. I stood in the kitchen, still holding a dish towel, the weight of everything pressing down. I heard him, upstairs, packing, moving through rooms with a purpose I couldn't stop. I heard the door again. Then nothing. He was gone. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes. Hours. The world seemed to blur at the edges. I finally sank into a chair, the fabric cold against my skin, and let my hands fall into my lap. The ache in my chest was so sharp it felt physical. He, my husband's nephew, stood in the doorway, uncertain, not stepping forward. Our eyes met, and in that look, everything passed between us: regret, loss, the impossibility of undoing what had been done. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Later, I heard the sound of his suitcase being zipped, the soft thud as he set it by the front door. He paused on his way out, his silhouette framed by the hallway light, and gave me a look I will remember for the rest of my life, an apology, a goodbye, a wish that things had turned out differently. And then he was gone too. The house held its breath in the dark. The clock ticked on. The refrigerator hummed. The world outside continued, indifferent to what had just changed inside these walls. I was alone. There are no words to soften what followed. I moved through the next hours like a ghost, touching familiar objects with unfamiliar hands. The note sat on the counter for a long time before I could bear to pick it up. I read the words I had written, the words that had started all of this, and I realized they could never be taken back. When morning came, the world looked the same, but I had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. There was no undoing any of it. Only the quiet, the empty rooms, the ache of loss, and the knowledge that the story I had been living was over. If there is a lesson in any of this, I haven't found it yet. Maybe one day, I will. For now, all I can do is sit with the silence and try to remember who I was before everything changed.